But he does practice religiously, so that takes up a lot of his morning. This is my kitchen, my office, my everything. I mean, this room gets the most of sunlight, so we keep laughing. Everybody wants to spend most of the morning in the kitchen, who gets here first. So we end up, you know, Nigel would even practice here in the morning because it's nicer. And I would sit here with all my laptop paperwork, and as pathetic as I am, cooking food for the dogs as well as ourselves.
Did you talk to Agnieszka? I've really been asking her to say, that Kennedy's... All he does is he does all except play the violin and eat the food and leave mess in the flat. That's what I wanted to say.
I don't think she's right.
I don't think so, but I've been trying to hand her 50
I do think to myself, what's she doing with him?
Yeah.
That did occur to me.
Yeah.
So she fell in love with you, did she?
I think it's not for me to say, but I presume so, yeah.
And how are you returning the compliment?
Well,
by building a house here.
Yeah, by building a house here and, like, hopefully, you know, planning that we live our life together in the most beautiful way possible. You know, the great thing about Agnieszka, and one could say this of quite a few Polish people, but, like, particularly about Agnieszka, is that she's not infatuated with style and fashion, and she's into some of the real core values of life, and it's like...
Living with you, I don't see how she could be infatuated with style and fashion.
Exactly. I mean, the antithesis is here.
Nigel invites me to a jam session at the historic Muniaka Jazz Club, a stone's throw from his apartment.
Look, oh, Muniaka man.
Yeah, look,
here we are.
I think this is the guy.
Yeah, it's a geezer, isn't it?
Yeah.
The local nuisance, man. Let's go and have a look.
Club owner and saxophonist Janusz Muniak has been the heart and soul of Polish jazz since the 1950s, and he may just be Nigel's biggest fan.
I was simply stunned by his unusual behavior for someone who plays classical music, yet at the same time I was struck firstly by the perfection with which he played, and secondly by the untypical way he dressed. He broke all conventions. When he first came to the club, it was like a great party. A lot of friendships were forged that night, and it became a canvas for Nigel to create his band. It gives me a lot of satisfaction that Nigel made friends with blokes who learned their trade here. There was one time after a jam session that he was still playing outside the club in the early morning. People from nearby apartments started shouting, "Don't you know what time it is? It's 5 in the morning." Nigel was playing with some guy behind a skip, one on guitar and one on violin. This place suits him.
Nigel has always loved jazz, but it was hearing the jazz violin of Stefan Grappelli that made him realize how much the instrument was capable of.
He would invite me every week or so on a weekend when I was free from the school commitments. So I got a lot of experience just jamming, basically. You know, he'd play most of a show, then I'd come on like at the end and play for about 15 minutes. But it was, for me, an action-packed 15 minutes where I learned a lot about music.
Yehudi Menuhin enjoyed duetting with his old friend Stefan and encouraged Nigel to follow suit. But other parts of the classical establishment were less open-minded.
Do you encourage his interest in jazz?
It's very difficult for a young person who's preparing for a concert career to get enough time to do the practicing that he needs to do. And of course, to be in school at the same time and then carry the practicing load and do jazz on top of it seems to me to be a very difficult thing.
First of all, they thought playing jazz would be bad for your technique as opposed to the actual truth, which is it helps you listen and you can work with harmony in a much more substantial way than if you don't know anything about harmony. So it obviously makes you better as a musician to be playing jazz. But in those days, particularly my professor Dorothy DeLay, she really thought it would kill my career if I went off and played in this one concert, which was in Carnegie Hall. And so Stefan, I went there and said hello, and he said, "Hey, you come and play with me?" And I said, "No, my teacher says I can't," And so he was quite put out, I think. I mean, obviously he should be. I've got one of the great violinists of the world offering me to play, and I'm saying no thanks very much. I mean, that's not very complimentary or paying enough respect to the guy. And so I sat in his dressing room, got through 2/3 of a bottle of scotch that he'd got lying around there, and then just staggered onto the stage and played with him. And I'm really pleased I'd done it because I remembered everything. But my teacher was right, because she told me well, you'll lose your career with CBS, which is now Sony. They're interested in you, but they won't be if you do that. And yeah, she was correct. Once I'd done that, they weren't interested. Some executives had been in that hall and they'd heard me and say, well, he's not fit to be on classical label then.
In the West, the 1950s brought the hedonistic noise of rock and roll. But in Poland, under communism, listeners needed music which kept its secrets to itself. They found solidarity within the intricate cross-currents of jazz.
Jazz was always like a song of freedom. In the hard times in the 50s, there was a time in Poland that jazz was forbidden by government. That was not legal to play jazz. And stupid people from government at that time, they didn't understand that even if they don't like jazz, they want to be jazz audience because jazz audience was against system.
Polish instrumental jazz became the resistance music because no one knew what the music was about. It couldn't be censored because there weren't words. And so the musicians used to get together and it used to be the freedom music, in the same way that when jazz started in America, it was freedom music for our black brothers.
There's a lot of stories at that time. The jam session underground in the cellar, in the private houses, there was 150 people, It was jam session till 5 o'clock in the morning.
These were gatherings of friends who risked their lives just to listen to jazz music.
Even by Poland's turbulent standards, the last 30 years have brought momentous social and political change. During the 1980s, Soviet rule crumbled in the face of the Solidarity movement and perestroika.